Welcome. My name is Tom Hood. I'm the CEO of the Maryland Association of CPAs, and I'm here with our incoming chair, Ray Speciale, who happens to be an educator up at Mount St. Mary's. Ray, why don't you say hi to everyone?
Thank you, Tom, and welcome everyone. Glad you could join us today.
And Ray has been on tour with me, along with some of our other executive committee, for the last 2 years at town hall meetings, talking to many of you about some proposed governing document changes. That would include both our charter and our bylaws. And so we're going to give you kind of how this all came about, what we proposed, what happened over the last couple of years with exposure to our membership and our town hall results, and then talk about kind of what's leading up to what we hope would be a positive vote by all of you on our recommended changes. So with that, I want to start with, as Ray came in as incoming chair, he takes on our board planning role for next year when he's chair. And in that, he gave us an update of the changes in the profession. And I think that sets the story for all the proposed changes that we've got.
It does, Tom. And actually, from a governance standpoint, and obviously as board members, one of our primary concerns is effective governance of the organization and the association. We're trying our best to stay on top of what's going on in the profession.
Yeah.
And it was timely that last year when we were at the AICPA council meeting down in Florida, I think it was October, we got a really good overview of the environment now that CPAs are now operating in.
Yeah.
And what we know is that things are changing fast, and some of the items that we looked at are up on the slide that you see here. Technology changing, we're seeing, and it was a real eye-opener for me to see the kinds of firm composition that we're seeing. When I started, we were talking about a bunch of CPAs in the CPA firm. Now, as you'll see when we get into this, that has dramatically shifted to other professionals. And this is something that as a board, we can't ignore. And I think that what we're looking at here, the overall picture is going to be governance changes that hopefully are going to allow us to embrace this kind of change, to be able to move with it more effectively in the future.
Yeah, yeah. So, one of the slides he came up with was the changes in roles in our profession. And this is, many of you guys have seen us talk about the World Economic Forum and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And this is out of their Future of Jobs report from last year in 2018. And they were showing the top 10 jobs or roles that are declining. And certainly this is not new to any of us, but accounting, bookkeeping, and payroll clerks, that's the basic data entry stuff, is declining pretty rapidly. And even to the point of accountants and auditors. There might be less of us, or more importantly, we'll be doing different things than we were traditionally.
I think that was really the point that's being made, is that auditors and accountants, who are especially in the public realm, and I think actually I shouldn't say especially in the public realm, all of them, government, industry, we're going to see a different role for many of these accountants and auditors, and prepping for that is part of what we should be doing.
And I think, quite frankly, it's a positive role. We're going to be moving up the value chain, doing more insights and more work that we always wanted to do but never had time to do because we were worried about cranking the numbers and that kind of thing.
That's right.
So this led to, and Ray's already alluded to it, the changing structure of firms. Now, this report comes from Accounting Today, but Ray, why don't you start out with kind of what your aha was, and we'll talk more about it.
My eyes were opened when I saw that when we're talking about the top 100 CPA firms, we're really talking now about a roughly 3-to-1 ratio of other professionals, non-CPAs to CPAs. Like I said earlier, when I got in back in the late 80s, we were talking, when you walked around the firm, there was maybe an HR person, there was maybe somebody who was an actuary, but the vast majority of the people there were CPAs, or they were headed toward their CPAs. And to some degree, to my surprise, I felt somewhat embarrassed to be surprised by this, but clearly the environment has changed. And as I understand it, this isn't just reflective of the top 100 firms. This is also being reflected in smaller and regional firms
Local
as well.
firms.
So I mean, when we look at those other client service professionals, I can't even begin to name them all, but we are probably still talking about people like high-end professionals like actuaries, IT professionals, lawyers to some degree. There is a really high-end mix in there, and these are people who are supporting CPA firms. CPAs are really supervising the work of these folks, and we've got to start positioning ourselves as a profession to make this work.
I mean, I've heard Barry Melanson, CEO of the AICPA, talk about it as a CPA-led profession as opposed to a CPA-only profession. So I think the good news is it keeps the CPA in charge, the quarterback, whether you're in corporate or a firm or other organizations. But it means you have a whole cast of characters that you're now, as you said, supervising and managing that become part of that whole group that's providing those services.
There's really going to be far more of a team involved in all of this. And sometimes they will be led, sometimes the others may be the leaders, especially if we're talking about the corporate or government environment.
Right.
Obviously, in the traditional public accounting firms, the CPAs, because they're the licensed professionals that need to sign off, are going to be, by virtue of that, the leaders. And Tom, you had also mentioned earlier, and we had talked about at the council, this pyramid structure.
Yeah. So the pyramid, the traditional pyramid is what we all know, and it's true the way we've worked our way up from entry level all the way up to partner, or entry level all the way up to CFO, is kind of the two sides of our profession. You're now seeing that little green triangle is what's being outsourced, often by either into other countries and stuff doing this work, and getting rid of that as another contract work. And the other green on the right side would be the automation thing. So the notion of automation inside the companies, robotic process automation, artificial intelligence, all those things are now automating. And so we're seeing a kind of even shift in the traditional structure of a firm.
Actually, from an educator standpoint, one very interesting problem that brings up, it just sort of hit me now, was we're producing our product, right? These students who have gone through a 4-year degree are the ones who are entering that, but they're entering a much narrower scope, and it's interesting to see that a lot of the jobs that they would traditionally be doing may be gone.
And it's going to make some major changes in education, we think. That's got to change what you guys do.
Absolutely.
Right? So this is back to that changing profession, and I think what we talked about at the board was how do we become very nimble and even proactive so we can anticipate these changes and be ready and not have to go through massive governance roles to reflect those changes as we adopt in this profession. So the other one I think that's worth saying, which gets back to the changes in our profession, is you all as members are experiencing moderate to severe destruction. 80%, up from 73% back in 2017, have said moderate to severe, you're feeling moderate to severe disruption. This is practitioners, this is business industry, and it's all size, from like public company, public accounting, big firms, all the way down to small solo folks. It's a consistent theme, and it says that, things are happening. And again, this is back to how do we make sure our profession is ready to deal with it, and what can we be doing to help you all be more future ready, which is obviously another whole piece that we work on.
Yeah, and I'd say Tom and I often go back and forth on the use of the word disruption. I think it's a great word, but I think it also sometimes implies negativity. I think that sometimes when we look at that word, we ought to look at it as a positive change.
Opportunity.
That may be the better way to look at it.
Yeah, it's a great way. And many CPAs are leading the changes needed in business to prevent further digital disruption, or in fact flip it so that you're now transforming so that you can take advantage of this stuff. So I think that's where we see that, but that's no question that we're in a changing role of this profession. So this gets back to why, and Ray, I'll let you speak a little bit to this because you've been really leading this whole, helping us get through these bylaws.
Right. A couple of years ago, I just started on the board. I didn't know any better. And Tom looked at me and said, maybe it's time to take a look at the bylaws. And I started with the bylaws, and I of course, noticed that they had not been updated for about 17 years. I also took that opportunity to take a look at our charter documents, which is really our articles of incorporation. That's our document that's on file with the state of Maryland. And I noticed that that document hadn't been looked at by the board for about 26 years. And with respect to the charter, the thing that really hit me over the head was that what happened back in 1992 was that the board amended the charter, and that's not unusual. Charters do need amendment from time to time. But then almost immediately, a few months later, in 1993, that amendment was corrected. So what we've got right now out there is an amended charter and then a corrected amendment. And it did seem to me like, with respect to the charter, it'd probably be a nice idea to streamline that and go ahead and make sure we've got one nice clean document for anybody to look at. We did, and you'll see this theme mentioned again, but I think it's worth emphasizing. With respect to the charter, we made no substantive changes there. The mission and the purpose, which is really the core of that document, remains in place. Nothing has changed there. The thing that immediately struck me when I looked at the bylaws was that, in fact, there was a lot of space,
multiple pages,
right, dedicated to the ethics process if somebody should run afoul of the rules. And then what I learned after very quickly getting to the folks here was that we weren't using that process, that in fact we were using a system that's been developed through AICPA, and that meant at a bare minimum we had to amend the bylaws to reflect the reality of what we were doing there. And then once we looked at that, we started to think about all the things that we've been talking about and the need for us to be able to more easily make changes in these documents moving forward. So, and Tom can talk a little bit about the changes that were reflected and that we wanted to bring to members, and we did bring to members starting in 2016
right,
with the town halls. I know you went through a series of those.
Yeah, we've been, this is we've always done town halls, but we specifically went over changes in the profession and what it meant and what we were talking about at the board. And there were two big moments. One was reflecting the CGMA initiative by the AICPA, which was the AICPA has been allowing non-CPAs to sit for the CGMA. That's where they're headed with that. So you can have CGMAs, who many of us were grandfathered into, and then you can have CGMAs who now are getting a license. So it's a CPA going through the lowest level of getting certified there. And if you're a non-CPA, you have to go through a bunch more steps. But the idea was to make their membership available for that. So we were exploring what would that mean to us, because if we have CGMAs who are CPAs and CGMAs who are not CPAs in Maryland, should we allow them as members? And that we had a professional colleague membership category, and that's how we thought we would handle that. But we took it to members to see what they thought. And overwhelmingly, the members were okay with the CGMA notion. There were concerns about dilution. We'll talk about a little bit more with the CPA versus non-CPA, CPA CGMA. And in fact, what we said is we ought to think about where does that go down the road. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk a little bit about this stuff. But then I think the other part was then we said, well, should we follow the American Institute of CPA model, which is they renamed themselves the American Institute of Certified Professional Accountants to reflect professionals certified, degree, with an extra certification, but not the gold standard of the CPA. And so we want to do, I think our board said, this is a trend that's happening. We're going to see it more and more. Should we talk about it? So we said, let's go out and talk to members about it. Well, I think I want to put that in the context of how the profession's changing, and then we'll talk about what we put forth to you guys and what you said, and then we'll talk about what we now are kind of coming back to you with. So this is after all 3 years worth of dialogue. So the accounting ecosystem slide you see right now shows the profession. So if you look at on the left of the yellow circle are two categories, public accounting and business industry. That's the traditional CPA world we live in today. Roughly 500,000 plus CPAs, half of whom are in public accounting, half of whom are in business, industry, government, nonprofits. So that group obviously hasn't changed. You know, it's going through the licensing process, et cetera. The next chunk are what I'd call the supporting cast, who are working with CPAs, as we talked about. So the 920,000, like almost double the number of CPAs, are non-CPAs, other accountants and auditors, personal financial advisors, tax preparation people inside of CPA firms. So that's, you know, roughly 1 million there. You can see there's another chunk of them beyond that, Ray, from that stat from the accounting top 100. Then on the corporate world, business and industry, government, not-for-profit, there's almost, 2.5 times more of them, 1 million, 1.3 million, who are management analysts, financial managers, and other analysts. These are professionals, certified CMAs, CIAs, CGMAs, all the alphabet soup, but they're not CPAs.
And I would add in that group, probably now what I see more of, even in my practice world, is database folks.
Data analysts, IT people.
That's right.
Yeah.
Actuaries.
Yeah. Yeah. Same thing. So the profession has that, you know, 2.2 million that are over and above CPAs inside the CPA world, if you will.
They're part of the ecosystem.
Correct.
And it can't be ignored.
And then there's also the bookkeepers. So there's 1.5 million bookkeepers and clerks who are not even degreed for the most part, but certainly not certified in any meaningful way. And the reason we have them set out there is in our association, that's the bright line that we've always talked about. Our small practitioners often compete with these people. And Ray, many of them, they say, I can do everything a CPA can except I'm cheaper. And we're like, no, that's not accurate, right? Because you don't have insurance, you're not taking CPE, you're not doing the things that a CPA does. So I think in our notion of anything we were thinking about membership at our board level, that's the bright line that we never cross. Like we never would let them in our membership. And that's true today as it always has been. But that's what I think is significant as we talk about what are we kind of going with. Now, one other point I think that you guys should look at is the trust in our profession is extremely strong. This is the core, our audit, right, which is the main thing we're licensed for. And so if you look at that, the research on Main Street investors, public company auditors, 81% trust and 80% in independent audit committees. Wasn't always that high. Obviously, Sarbanes-Oxley days, et cetera. But the point is, that's important to us. It's part of what our purpose is MACPA is protecting that public interest. Now, one more slide, then we'll start getting into the kind of meat of what we're talking about. This is what we also call, at our board, we now call it the bathtub problem.
It is.
Right? So what happens when the water going into the bathtub is going in at a rate that's less than the water leaving the bathtub, the water level, which would be our numbers of members, actually starts to go down. And I joke, but it's not a joke. Our fastest growing membership category is life members who no longer pay dues and retired members. And so if you look at this kind of gives you the latest pipeline stats from NASBA and the AICPA. So in that, remember the 550,000 CPAs from the other slide. This is showing where they come from. So the good news is the accounting degrees are still very popular and still very strong. That's a record in the last 5 years. But what that means is all those folks coming in, 82,000 per year are going into the pipeline. Here's what happens. 42,000 never sit. They become other qualified professionals, which is that 920,000 number. Or they don't pass the exam. 14,000 fail, and then they give up.
Sometimes as an educator, it's very hard to watch, but they will, and Tom's exactly right. I'm shocked now as an educator to find out how many of my students who have graduated just don't even take the exam. They've taken positions in either government or with larger firms, maybe in the consulting arm
or corporate.
And they've made the decision early on that they don't need it.
Yeah.
I think obviously a short-sighted decision, but nonetheless a decision that they've made. So as Tom's pointing out here, what's happening is that with the potential pool of people graduating with a degree, a smaller and smaller portion are actually entering the realm of licensure
CPAs.
as CPAs. And this is a trend that has run unabated for the last few years, I think.
And growing. So we're at 1 and 3. Obviously, we have a whole lot of programs to kind of inspire students and inspire people to take the exams. We have a CPA candidate membership. We're starting CPA exam study groups, all to help tilt that a little bit more in our favor, Ray. But you're right. You were saying earlier that the students seem to give up earlier even. I mean, it used to be you might take it 5 times, but people would still do that. I don't think many of them do that anymore.
Well, part of the problem too, and maybe it's not a problem, it's just the environment we're in, that many of them are able to get initial jobs. They're able to get their first gigs, essentially, and they don't see any differential. All that they're looking at often is that starting pay.
Yeah.
And they're not really seeing a significant enough difference in the starting pay for those who might be on the CPA track versus those who might be on the consulting track or IT track to see that there's an immediate need for it. And often, let's face it, if they're younger folks, they're thinking more in the moment. And it is hard to convince them that CPA is going to be a great separator for them, a great distinctive feature that they'd be able to hold on to 20 years down the road when it really will matter to them.
So that's kind of, so you guys have what we would call the current context that our board talks about, has been talking about for the last few years. So here's the big change that came about a year ago. As we went through the CGMA realm, massive acceptance by members of saying, move forward on CGMA. We're okay with non-CPA CGMA people becoming affiliate members, or in our new category of professional colleagues, I think is what we named it. And so then we said, but the notion that our board said, well, what if we were to follow that AICPA lead and become the Maryland Association of Certified Professional Accountants and embrace these people as full members? And in that one, I think you as our members in the town halls kind of drew a line. You still basically said, we're okay with what you're thinking. We agree that there's a lot of changes and we trust the board. That was the message that came through clear. What you did say, your really biggest concern was dilution. And if you remember, Ray, they said, I'm imagining that if they were all equal members, that category of non-CPA, CGMA and others would grow much faster than the CPA because of what we just talked about.
Actually, right. We just made the argument for that particular side of this, and that is that easily, if you do that, you could see that the non-CPAs could become the majority.
So then the notion was that if your name is the Maryland Association of Certified Professional Accountants, the logic went, well, that means that the membership base that's voting could start to say, stop putting resources in the CPA. It's a declining thing. Don't do it. And so things like our legislative CPA day and all the work we do to protect the license could come under scrutiny, right? A board would have to listen to those members making that kind of an argument.
And maybe worse, and we did listen to our members, and this is where we're headed.
Right.
There could potentially be conflicts.
Right.
And that was another issue that came up in those town halls.
Yeah. So the board then said, you know what? We're not going to change the name. We're not going to let those folks have full voting rights like a full member does today. And that's, I think, where we drew the bright line, and that's what we're coming back to you with. Although we are still cleaning up the bylaws and the charter, as Ray said, and we are giving and we'll talk about in a minute, we are giving the board more discretion over changing categories because we think we're going to have a different mix of categories, but between voting and non-voting, but the voting will always stay in the CPA side. And that's what we reflect in these documents. So we're going to amend the bylaws. We're going to tell you about that in a minute. The purpose of the corporation stayed exactly the same as we talked about. So there's been no changes there, and there will be no changes to the name. It will be the Maryland Association of Certified Public Accountants from now forward. And I think we left a charter change, which is where the name would come in, would have to be done through a full membership vote.
It is important to note, and I'm not doing it in the order of the slide here, but we do have this change to the charter, again, to emphasize that no change at all to the purposes. And if we were to ever consider any change to the charter, it has to go to the full membership for a vote.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's important in the context of some of the changes, though, that we're making to the bylaws. And if I go over some of those now, Tom, I will.
Yeah, when we go to that, well, go ahead.
No, this is fine.
Talk through it, and then we'll reiterate it at the end when we ask about, here's what you'd be voting on.
Right. And so one of them is that, in fact, and I mentioned this earlier, that we will, in fact, reflect the reality now with respect to the ethics and how we're handling any kind of ethics violations through the program with AICPA. We have, in fact, streamlined committee structures so that you'll see that we've got a lot of committees, but we streamlined the board's ability in the proposed document, the proposed bylaws, to develop committees and monitor them and govern them. An important change to the bylaws, and this is why we're bringing it to you, is that the board would now have the ability to modify the bylaws as needed with a 2/3 vote. We are also mandating, and I think this is very important, that the board be composed of a majority of active CPAs, which had not been previously required. And finally, and this is what Tom's been alluding to, we're going to wind up asking you for some flexibility in the ability to develop, sometimes abolish, affiliate non-voting memberships and members.
Yeah. So I think it just reflects us being able to be nimble and agile as we see the changing profession come, as well as protecting the core CPA member that we've always been founded for. So a couple things that's worth noting. This is what about 20% of our membership said over last year when we said, here's the changes that we're making based on the original year of feedback. So this idea that Ray's just talking about, what we're proposing, doubling down on the CPA, not changing our name, keeping our purpose, 86.8% of you all out in the town halls who've had a chance to talk about it many times with our executive committee members have said you're in support. You either like it or love it or can live with it. 12% said they didn't like it, and that was actually split between some of those who said you're not going far enough, you should have went all the way where you were headed, and 6% saying I don't like it at all, I don't even want you to have that extra change in authority.
And I think that's a fair assessment from the actual town halls that I attended. The folks I spoke to, some of them did want us to go more in the direction of the certified professional accountant route. But, you know, those who really didn't like it were pretty vehement in their concern about that. And I'm proud that the board did look at that and really reflected on it carefully and then said, we're going to stick with the anti-dilution approach, I'll call it, of maintaining this as a CPA organization.
Yeah. So I think, you know, we've said it, but we're basically doubling down.
Right.
And we're staying true to that whole MACPA, Maryland CPA purpose and mission, and that's what's going on. So now back to, you know, Ray's kind of talked through it a little bit, but just let's kind of quickly talk about some of the what we would call the changes that you're going to see in the charter and the bylaws, and that we're ultimately asking for your support of in a vote.
Right. I jumped the gun a little bit before, but it's worth mentioning again that the charter will now be one unitary document, which I think it should be. For an organization like ours, nobody should have to look through an amendment and then a correction to the amendment. It should be one piece of paper that everybody can look at. And so that's really the key there. But again, please keep in mind that there really isn't any substantive change to that charter that's been made. We did clean it up, though, and update it. And, you know, this is something that any organization would need to do every few years. We did, as I mentioned earlier, and this is important to, I think it's worth emphasizing again, that the board will need to have a majority of active licensed CPAs on that board. That's going to require some oversight by us, but that's worth it, we think,
Yeah.
because it will properly reflect the kind of members who we're representing. We do, in fact, through this change, again, with a 2/3 vote, the board will have the ability now, the agility to change the bylaws. And again, let me go back to that ethics change, which is the fourth one. Every time something comes up in the profession, the board has to at least reflect on it. Sometimes, this doesn't happen every time, but sometimes the changes that are going on out there, sometimes things we might want to do. That is one of them, in fact, looking at ethics questions. We may need to respond to changes, and we need to be able to do that sometimes on a dime.
Yeah.
And obviously, we were working with an outdated set of bylaws for some years. We can't keep on doing that.
Yeah.
We need to have that authority. And again, it's going to require a 2/3 vote of the board membership. So we think that any changes that are made are not going to be made without great reflection and due diligence. And we've also beefed it up a bit. Even though it was 17 years ago, they still had the foresight to talk about electronic communication in the old document, but now we've beefed that up to really reflect just about any kind of electronic communication.
Yeah.
So that really reflects the major substantive changes in the document.
Yeah. Couple things just to kind of show you what we are today under this new proposed bylaws, et cetera, would be, here's how the categories of membership would look the way we're talking about it, right? The bylaws, we had the ability to have non-CPA members from 20 years ago, but these are defined as affiliate members. And I think one of the things that came up in the town hall was, I don't want to ever see someone holding out as a member of the Maryland Association of CPAs who's not a licensed CPA, who could deceive the public, right? So if I gave you my business card and said, Tom Hood, who's a CGMA but not a CPA, is a member of the Maryland Association, you might think I'm a CPA. So by saying I can only say I'm an affiliate of the MACPA, I think that makes that clear. And that came from the grassroots, quite frankly. That's what these guys were saying in the town hall. So now students, who we have as existing categories, CPA candidates, and then professional colleagues. And we have two examples there, a non-CPA CGMA and a non-CPA CMA, charter or certified management account. Those are all legitimate folks, and that's how they would be classified. Now, if they were CPAs, they would just be in the normal membership like a CPA member.
They'd be in the voting category.
Exactly. So voting is left side, member, educators who are CPAs, active duty military who are CPAs, retired CPAs, and leave of absence would all be continuing the voting privileges and normal membership status.
And a lot of the board's focus on the professional colleague group as affiliates goes back to the point of we don't even know right now what's going to be 3, 4, 5 years, maybe even next year for that matter.
Right.
So there's this constant influx of professionals who mean more and more to the process, that mean that CPAs are in fact engaged with in
Right.
their work. And we need to be able to respond to that so that we're able to bring them into the fold, so that we're able to interact with them as an association.
Exactly. And then the other one would be the committee structure of our association. So, in the old bylaws, there were some references to some committees, but not all committees. And there are many committees that weren't in there. So anyhow, there was a mixture of things that were there, but no longer in service, and many that weren't listed at all. So we thought we would at least show you them. But in the future, the bylaws won't reference them specifically. They're up to the board to create and dismantle as needed.
Right. I think the few that we've now referred to in the proposed bylaws are the executive committee and the nominating committee. But we've tried to minimize the number of committees that we actually named, because we realize that, again, in another year or 2 or 3, this is all going to change, and we need to be flexible enough to respond to the need for effective governance. I could tell you that when I first saw this list that Tom gave me, I said, wow, we've got a lot of committees going on here. And one of the very first things we'll probably have to do if this proposal goes through, or even if it doesn't, is we'll have to take a look at all of this and make sure that every committee has a very clear charter, that they've got a clear charter or commission, and that the board actually understands what's going on out there.
Yep. So I think as we wrap up here, this is who our board is today. So all the folks that have been deliberating on all this in the last year are on screen. You can see our chair, Samantha Bowling, obviously Ray, who's with me here, Chair-elect, Secretary Treasurer Avenette Blanding, and then Ken Kelly is our past chair. But look at the roles. They're from all over the state. They all practice as CPAs in different ways. And we're, quite frankly, very proud of the diversity on our board. We do have one non-CPA by charter that's on our board, and that's Leon Katz-Nelson, who is a CTO up at IBM. So that's our public member who's a non-CPA. That's been in effect for a bit. So that's the folks that are asking for your support of this bylaws amendment. And then we put in there a conferences IO for many of you who are at town halls, but if you don't, you're just going to go to that URL, put it in your device, and you'll get a couple of questions to let us know what you're thinking. We're going to ask you, what do you think about this current bylaws proposal, as well as a couple thoughts about this presentation. And with that, let's say goodbye to everyone, Ray.
Have a good one. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.